I was standing in the shadows of a vineyard wedding when I realized I wasn't just a guest, I was the target. The champagne sparkled. The music charmed. But every laugh? Every toast? It was cover fire. And the groom? He was about to launch an attack, with my name in the crosshairs. The vineyard looked like a painting come to life, white tents fluttering like sails, string lights glowing like captured stars, and the sky, polished brass with a whisper of autumn. It was late September in Northern Virginia, and everything about that day told a story of celebration, except mine. I stood under the eaves of the tasting room, Pinot Gris in hand, alone but alert. My name is Avery Quinn, 35. Former Army Signals officer. Now, I rent a studio over a bowling alley in South Philly, work midnight IT shifts at the VA, and still keep a duffel bag packed by the door like I'm waiting for a mission that never comes. This wasn't my wedding. It wasn't even my crowd. I was here for my sister Lena, who was marrying a man with more tech buzz than backbone. Julian Vale. A rising fintech star with charm like polished chrome, flashy, smooth, and cold to the touch. He stood at the head table, raised his crystal flute, and with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences, he smiled. "My darling Lena," he began, voice sliding across the speakers I'd already clocked. "And to the families that made us. Some of us were born to build empires, companies, futures. Others, well, some just salute." Polite laughter followed. Polite. Calculated. And every note of it stung like shrapnel. My shoulder twitched an involuntary response, but I didn't move. Because silence, I learned long ago, is overwatch. You wait. You watch. You let the enemy show you who they are. Julian had just revealed his coordinates. I scanned the lawn. Neat trellises. Tent guy wires. Waiters in formation. Guests sipping legacy wines, their attention fixed on a man spinning a story about brilliance and vision and money. They didn't see me. Not really. Just a quiet sister in a navy dress. A placeholder in the family album. They didn't know I was mapping every inch of the battlefield. I thought of Sergeant Hale, my old CO in Kandahar, killed in an ambush. He gave me my field compass, the one in my purse right now. Its nickel casing worn smooth, lens cracked from a fall in the Hindu Kush. He once told me, "The only people who need to know your name are the ones you're saving." My name, here, meant nothing. And Julian? He was counting on that. Counting on my silence. He lifted his glass again. To the kind of work that pays off. The kind that builds empires, not just bridges. Laughter again. Sharper this time. Louder. He was feeding the crowd. Setting the tone. And I was still. Controlled. Listening to the hum of the crowd shift into something colder. Something weaponized. This wasn't just a job. It was a message. They erased my name. Repurposed my silence. Misread my discipline. I was a soldier in a war they didn't even realize they were waging. But I had seen this pattern before. And I wasn't going to answer with noise. I was going to answer with precision. A surgical strike. Before we go any further, I want to know, where in the world are you hearing this from? Drop it in the comments. Because no matter where we are, pain and strength, they speak the same language. Before the hum of that vineyard, before Julian's words and the laughter, there was a quiet that had always been mistaken for nothing. My life wasn't about public declarations or grand gestures. It was about small, precise routines. A morning run along the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the distant traffic of I-76. I'd grab a black coffee from the corner spot, the one with the cracked bell, before heading into the VA. My job there was to untangle messy IT systems and secure sensitive data, the kind of work nobody ever sees. It was a perfect fit. I was a ghost in the machine, and I liked it that way. The pattern of being overlooked had its own rhythm. It started years ago. I'd always been the one in the background, the one who made things work while others took the credit. In my family, my younger sister, Lena, was the star. She had a flair for the dramatic, a career in finance PR that thrived on sound bites and spectacle. I was the responsible one, the one who handled the logistics, the one who was always ready to help. I would be asked to just run the cables for family gatherings while Lena was giving toasts. I'd be the one who organized the silent auction for charity events while she was on stage, accepting the awards. This pattern wasn't just in my family. It followed me to work. I had spent months building an open-source data ledger for a grant program at the VA, a tool that streamlined micro-grant distribution to veterans' families. I worked on it at night, after my regular shift, putting in the quiet, painstaking hours that nobody saw. When the project was presented, the HR director forgot to add my name to the credits. I wasn't even mentioned in the email. They just called it a team effort. I didn't correct them. It didn't feel like my job to get credit. It felt like my job to get the work done. I was an architect of the foundation, not the face on the billboard. I didn't realize how much of a pattern this had become until Julian came into the picture. He met Lena at a conference in DC, and they were a perfect match. Both ambitious, both loud in their success, both masters of the narrative. Julian, with his social goods startup, Hydrian Civic, wanted to pilot a project with the VA. Lena knew I had connections and expertise from my military and IT background, and she asked me to talk to him. I met him for coffee one rainy afternoon in Georgetown. He was all brittle charm, all polished suit and practiced smile. I told him about the disaster relief network my old unit had built, the logistics of it, the secure communications. I even gave him a copy of my old memos, sanitized of course, for reference. He called them notes. He left with a stack of them and came back a few weeks later with a series of NDAs for me to sign. He said it was standard procedure. I was just trying to help. The foreshadowing was subtle. It was a crack in the foundation, a tiny hairline fracture I didn't see at the time. A few months after Julian got my memos, a series of patents and municipal impact bonds were filed by Hydrian Civic. The language in them was eerily familiar. It was as if he had taken my operational manuals and just swapped out a few words. My old CO, Griffin Park, called me from Fort Meade one day. He had seen an article about Julian and his company and asked, "Isn't that the same language we used for the field network in Afghanistan?" I just laughed it off. I told him it was a coincidence. A quiet hum had started then, a low frequency in the background that I had just assumed was a part of modern life. In that low hum, I found my rhythm. It was a daily cadence of being useful, but never seen. My world was made of tangible things: the click of a network cable, the cold weight of a kettlebell, the precise path of a run. It was a controlled existence. I was not a dreamer, I was a builder. I was not a voice, I was an echo. But a low, persistent sound was beginning to build. Like a car engine running in the distance, a low, persistent thrum that told you something was on its way, getting closer. The hum that started in the back of my mind began to get louder, more insistent. I remember once, Julian called me, saying he couldn't get a new prototype to work. He was panicked. I walked him through it over the phone, my fingers flying across my own keyboard, tracing the problem in the code. He said, "You're a lifesaver, Avery. I don't know what I'd do without you." The words were an easy lie, a line I had heard many times before. I just said, "Glad to help," and hung up the phone. I didn't see it then, but the crack was widening. It was a quiet tremor in the ground, and I was too focused on the task at hand to notice that the world around me was beginning to shift. I was so used to being invisible, I didn't see it as a vulnerability. I thought it was a quiet strength, a way to move through the world and get things done without the noise and the politics. I was wrong. The crack was not in my foundation, it was in the world's perception of me. And soon, it would be a chasm. The low, steady hum of the vineyard faded into the deafening silence of a memory, replaced by a sound far more intimate and devastating: the sudden, loud laughter of a crowd. It happened during the reception, after the dinner plates had been cleared. The band was on a break. The air was cool, but a different kind of tension, not from the weather, had settled in. Julian, ever the showman, grabbed the microphone for an impromptu speech. This time, it wasn't a toast to love. It was a soliloquy to his own genius. He spoke of Hydrian Civic, his company that streamlined municipal contracts and revolutionized urban development. The words were a cascade of empty buzzwords. Then he paused. His eyes, full of a practiced, brittle charm, found me in the crowd. "Of course," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "I have to thank my brilliant sister-in-law, Avery. Our family ranger. Always camping, never building." The polite snickers from the toast were nothing compared to this. A wave of laughter, loud and full-throated, swept through the crowd. It wasn't just Julian's words, it was the way he had said them. The subtle emphasis on ranger, the dismissive shrug, the way he looked at me like I was a simpleton who only knew how to follow orders. It was a direct, public dagger. My physical reaction was immediate and involuntary. My heart cadence, which had been a steady, calm rhythm, ticked up to a frantic beat, like a frantic telegraph. My fingertips went numb. I felt a cold dread seep into my veins. It was the physical stress reaction I knew all too well from my army days, the body preparing to fight or flee. But I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just stood there, a grenade with the pin still in, absorbing the blast. Julian was telling the story of Hadrian's new project in a small, forgotten town in the Rust Belt. He described it as a massive undertaking, a philanthropic mission to bring clean water to a community in crisis. A true act of civic engineering, he proclaimed, not a hobby. My mind was a blur of static, but a single, clear thought broke through the noise. It was the project I had laid the groundwork for years ago. The one I had written the original spec for. That's when the proof surfaced. Not in a dramatic reveal, but in a quiet, damning slip. One of Julian's partners, a man named Marcus with a florid face and a nervous energy, was speaking next. He pulled up a slide on a large screen at the front of the tent. It was supposed to be a success metric, a bar chart showing the project's impact. But for a split second, before the chart loaded, a flash of text appeared on the screen, a vendor invoice. My eyes locked onto it. The words Avery Quinn were in the upper right-hand corner, next to an account number I recognized. The invoice was for consultation services on the very project Julian was talking about, billed to Hadrian Civic. The number was astronomical. But that wasn't the most damning part. Below my name, in a small, almost unreadable font, were 2 words, Project Oversight. Suddenly, the laughter didn't feel so funny. The hum of the crowd shifted again, from amusement to confusion, and a quiet whisper started to move through the room. Julian's face, which had been so confident, went rigid. He tried to gesture to the projectionist to move to the next slide, but it was too late. The image was gone, but the stain of it remained. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. It was a frozen frame moment. A photographic image burned into my mind. The shock on Marcus's face. The panic in Julian's eyes. The half-open mouth of a woman in a floral dress, her glass held suspended in midair. They had used my name. They had used my expertise. And they had been caught. My body was still. My mind was in overdrive, assessing the damage, the optics, the next move. But all I could do was stand there frozen. I felt a suffocation, a rising dread that had nothing to do with the air in the room. I felt the weight of their deceit, the magnitude of the lie they had just told in front of hundreds of people. The laughter had died down, replaced by a strained, awkward silence. A silence that was now a weapon in their hands, as they tried to pretend nothing had happened. But I had to move. I had to get out. The air in the tent was thick, humid, and filled with 1,000 pairs of eyes on me. I turned and walked, not ran, but walked, away from the table, away from the laughter, away from the frozen frame. I felt the collective gaze of everyone in the tent on my back. I pushed through the tent flap and stepped out into the night air. It was a relief, a cold shock to the system that felt like a baptism. The night was dark, but the air was clear. I could hear the last echoes of the band's music, a lonely saxophone riff. I kept walking, the rustle of my dress the only sound I made. The manicured lawn gave way to a gravel path, and the string lights of the reception tent became distant stars. I could hear the faint, echoing sound of Julian's voice, now muffled, from inside the tent. I just kept walking. The scent of wood smoke, a reminder of the fire pits that had been lit earlier, filled the air. It was a simple, grounding scent. I walked until the vineyard was just a blur of lights, a dull glow on the horizon. I walked until all I could hear was the gravel crunching under my shoes and the sound of my own quiet, ragged breath. They had just humiliated me in front of hundreds of people. They had exposed me to a world I had no place in. The hum of the crowd, which had started as a warning, had now become the sound of public shame. And as I walked away, it was all I could hear. I just kept walking, the echo of their laughter and my own quiet rage, the only sound in the night. The sodium lights of the parking lot flickered in the distance, a cold, hard truth waiting for me at the end of the long road. I had to face the quiet, cold aftermath. The night air had been a shock to the system, but the real cold came later, in a cheap motel room outside of town. The fluorescent light hummed, a sterile, buzzing sound that was the new public hum of my shame. I had a half-eaten bag of pretzels on the nightstand, and the muted television played a local news report about the wedding, showing Julian and Lena smiling, their faces bright and triumphant. The anchor called him a visionary. The vision was a lie. I had to get my duffel from the car. I needed something solid, something real. Inside, at the bottom, was my old military-grade tablet. It was encrypted, and I had kept a meticulous, private record of every professional interaction I'd ever had. Every email, every memo, every line of code. I pulled it out, and the glowing screen was a single, defiant beacon in the darkness. The familiar weight of it in my hands felt like coming home. My fingers, still tingling from the stress reaction at the Vineyard, found their rhythm on the keyboard. I didn't know what I was looking for, not exactly. But I knew what I felt. The last few years of Julian's polished veneer, his sudden rise, the vague echoes of my work in his corporate branding. It all felt like a house of cards, and I was about to find the final, undeniable proof that would make it all collapse. I started with the vendor invoice I had glimpsed on the screen. The name Hadrian Civic and Avery Quinn were burned into my memory. I started pulling open my files, cross-referencing my own archived communications with Julian, with Lena. I found a string of emails from 2 years ago, when he was just starting out. He had asked me for my personal notes on a few projects. I had sent them to him, along with a few spreadsheets. I found a message from him saying, "Thanks, Ave, this is gold. You're my secret weapon." I had just laughed it off at the time. A crack I had dismissed as a playful lie was now a chasm of betrayal. The final piece of proof wasn't in my digital files. It was an email I found in my personal inbox, a misrouted vendor invoice from a company I had once recommended for Julian's firm, but had no direct contract with. It was addressed to an old email of mine, but it had my name on it. The invoice was from Hadrian Civic to the city of Port Huron, Michigan. The details were all there: the project, the date, and the insane amount of money Julian's company was charging for a unit that I knew cost a fraction of that. I had once written a blog post about how the open-source materials could be used to build a cost-effective version of the same unit, with a bill of materials that came in at just a few $100s. I had shared it with Julian, thinking it would help him. He had taken it, and then he had charged a small city $43,000 for it. My body went cold. It wasn't just my reputation he was stealing, it was money from a community that needed every penny. It was a cruel, calculated act of theft. The silence in the motel room was absolute. There was no hum, no static, just the deafening weight of a complete betrayal. My trust in him had collapsed. My trust in my own sister, who had stood by and watched him do it. My trust in the world, which had so easily believed his polished lies. I felt the silence become a physical presence in the room, a character in my story. It was a living thing, a heavy blanket that weighed me down. I had never felt so alone. I had no one to tell. I could feel my body vibrating with a low, desperate kind of energy, the kind that comes from having no outlet for the rage and the sorrow. I sat there for hours, the light of the tablet screen illuminating my face. The pain wasn't a sudden shock, it was a slow, seeping poison. I was mourning the loss of a friendship, a family bond, a sense of security. I had lost a part of myself that had believed in their goodwill. It was a deep, personal loss. But in that silence, a new sound began to emerge. It was not a hum of warning or a public static of shame. It was a low, steady pulse, a beat that was just my own. It was the sound of a vow being made, a quiet promise to myself. I wasn't going to get angry. I wasn't going to get even. I was going to get justice. Quiet justice. A justice that would not be loud, but would be surgical. I was going to build a new kind of ledger, a different kind of life. I would not just tell my story, I would show it. I placed the tablet on the nightstand and turned off the light. The room went black, and the silence was now just my own. I had no one to rely on but myself. It was a terrifying thought. But I knew what I had to do. I had to let the truth detonate. Have you ever stood inside this kind of silence, where trust collapses? If you have, you already know what I felt. So I began to watch and wait. I flew back to Philadelphia and went back to work. I still ran along the Schuylkill, still grabbed a coffee from the corner shop, still worked my night shifts at the VA. The hum of the bowling alley below my apartment, once a comfort, now felt like a low, relentless static. It was the sound of a hidden truth trying to break through. I just let it build. My silence, which had been misread as weakness, was my most potent tool. I had no interest in public outbursts or emotional confrontations. My training had taught me that a well-placed piece of intelligence was more powerful than any weapon. I just needed to find the right person to see it, and the right stage to reveal it. The spark of truth came from an unexpected source. A week after the wedding, I received a message on LinkedIn. It was from Priya Narang, the CTO of Hydrian Civic. She was a woman in her 40s with a quiet intensity, and I had met her briefly at the reception. Her message was simple. I can't be party to this. What they did to you is wrong. I have access to the company's mail server archives and change history logs for the past 3 years. They're all yours. I felt a surge of cold, calm authority. This wasn't a witness. This was a co-conspirator turning on her own. I didn't respond to the message immediately. I just let it sit there, knowing that the fear of exposure would be a far better motivator than any threat I could make. My silence was a strategy. I let the facts do the work. Priya, sensing my hesitation, followed up with a series of encrypted files. They were the server archives, a digital treasure trove of every lie, every forged document, and every deceitful communication. I went through them with a methodical, almost surgical precision. I found the vendor invoices, the client contracts, and the internal memos where Julian explicitly instructed his team to repurpose my original open-source work, scrubbing my name from every document and replacing it with the name of his company. Then I found the fatal slip. In a folder of scanned contracts and notarized documents, I saw it. A forged Avery Quinn signature on a contract with the city of Port Huron, Michigan. The signature was crudely copied, but what caught my eye was the notary stamp. The date was right, but the stamp itself had expired 2 months before the document was signed. I knew this because I had used the same notary for a personal matter, and she had mentioned it to me. The second piece of evidence was in the signature itself. It was a wet signature, and in the right light, a peculiar nick in the ink was visible, a tiny, almost microscopic line in the middle of the A. I knew that mark. It was from the bent nib of Julian's Montblanc fountain pen, the one he had proudly shown off on Instagram when he posted a picture of the wedding favors. Every single forged document featured that same, telltale defect. My strategy was simple: show, don't tell. My quiet justice wouldn't involve a screaming match or a public tirade. It would involve a very, very public presentation of the facts. The stage would be the Municipal Finance Forum in Washington, D.C. It was an event Julian was scheduled to speak at, a keynote to a room full of city managers and potential clients. I arranged to have my own presentation slot, a simple 5-minute talk on the importance of due diligence in public-private partnerships. I didn't tell anyone what I was going to do. I just showed up, a ghost in a dark suit, and stood in the back row as Julian began his talk. He was as smooth as ever, a practiced performance. He showed the very same slide from the wedding, the one that had the vendor invoice on it. He spoke of his groundbreaking work in Port Huron. When my turn came, I walked to the front of the room. The jumbotrons above the stage, which had been showing his company's polished logo, now showed a side-by-side overlay. The first image was the original bill of materials for my open-source unit, which showed the cost to be under $400. The second was a scanned copy of Julian's invoice to the city of Port Huron, which showed a cost of $42,900. I didn't say a word. I just let the images sit there. Then I pulled up another slide. A side-by-side comparison of the forged notary stamp and a picture of an expired one. Then, the kicker. A close-up of the bent nib on Julian's Mont Blanc from his own Instagram post, next to a close-up of the peculiar ink nick on the forged signature. The room was silent. A hushed, stunned quiet. Julian's face, on the jumbotron behind me, went pale. The moderator, a distinguished professor from Georgetown, turned to me, a look of complete bewilderment on his face. "Ms. Quinn," he said, "what does this mean?" I didn't answer. I just looked at the audience, then at Julian. My voice, when I finally spoke, was calm, decisive, and authoritative. It was the only line I needed. Document everything. That was the order. The room obeyed. They pulled out their phones, they took pictures, they started whispering. The balance had shifted. The silence that followed my one-line order was far more effective than any rant. The room at the Municipal Finance Forum was a study in stunned quiet. When the moderator finally recovered, he didn't even try to continue the program. He called for an unscheduled break, and the room emptied, but not before every city manager, every venture capitalist, every potential client of Julian's had seen the irrefutable evidence. The air in the conference hall, once filled with Julian's polished words, now carried the heavy scent of his downfall. I didn't stay for the aftermath. My work there was done. I took a cab straight to the train station and caught the first ride back to Philadelphia. The ride was silent. I just stared out the window, watching the landscape blur by, and felt a profound sense of release. The hum of public shame was gone. In its place was a new sound, a quiet, almost imperceptible ringing of peace. It was the sound of a well-executed plan coming to a close. The first step in my recovery was a strategic withdrawal. I didn't want to be near any of the static. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media, and muted the family group chat. The notifications stopped, and the silence was a welcome relief. It was like cutting a toxic vine from a healthy tree. My relationship with my sister was on hold. Lena called me once, her voice a mix of confusion and anger. "Why did you do that?" she asked. I just said, "I think you already know." She hung up. It wasn't my place to lecture her. The evidence was all there. She just had to choose to see it. My rebuilding wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming myself. I fell back into my old, disciplined routines, but with a new sense of purpose. My dawn runs by the Schuylkill became a ritual of cleansing. I felt the burn in my lungs and the cold air on my face, and with every step, I felt the weight of their betrayal fall away. My 3 sets of kettlebells became an exercise in quiet strength. My night shifts at the VA, once a chore, now felt like a calling. I was doing honest, tangible work that helped people, not harmed them. I started on a new project. I called it the Quiet Ledger Foundation. It was a small, focused team of veterans, civic CFOs, and water officers. We launched a simple, open-source audit tool, a system that would allow municipalities to transparently track their grant money and see where every dollar was going. It was a direct response to Julian's deceit, a quiet piece of architecture designed to make sure no one else could be robbed in the same way. It wasn't about fame or profit. It was about protecting the very communities he had sought to exploit. My chosen alliances were different now. They were built on shared values and mutual respect, not on family ties or social obligation. I met a woman named Ms. Ortiz, a tribal water officer from the Southwest who was looking for a way to secure funding for a new filtration system. I told her about the Quiet Ledger Foundation, and her eyes lit up. "You build it," she said, her voice warm steel, "and we will run it." I learned to live in a new kind of quiet. Not the quiet of being overlooked, but the quiet of being in control. I had a new, chosen family and a new, chosen purpose. I started a blog, a small, anonymous space where I wrote about the importance of open-source technology and ethical practice. I didn't mention Julian's name or my story. The posts were just a series of thoughts on the right way to do things. The site had no comment section, no social media links. It was a simple, disciplined way of putting my truth out into the world. I was building, but I was building in my own way, on my own terms. I was not the same woman who had stood in that vineyard. My posture was unbowed, my eyes were level. I had found a half-smile that read like a verdict, a small, quiet expression of strength that said I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of my own life. I had learned to discern the difference between the hum of a warning and the quiet of peace. I had traded the chaos of the city for the calm of a purpose. I didn't seek it out, it found me. Natural consequences, I've learned, are the most reliable form of justice. The Quiet Ledger Foundation was gaining traction. We had a small but dedicated team, and our open-source audit tool was being adopted by a handful of small municipalities in the Midwest. The news of Julian's public humiliation at the DC Forum had spread through financial circles like a slow-burning fire. There were no headlines, no scandals, just the quiet, institutional hum of due diligence and cold, hard facts. A few weeks after the forum, an email appeared in my inbox from a reporter at a small, niche trade publication. They had heard whispers. "We're doing a story on what happened at the forum," the email read. "Julian Vale is being investigated. Could we speak with you?" I didn't reply. I just forwarded the email to Priya Narang, the former CTO. Her conscience had set the chain of events in motion, and it was her story to tell if she chose. She did. She provided the reporter with a digital paper trail, the full unsanitized story of the forged documents, the expired notary stamps, and the fraudulent billing. The story ran, not on the front page of a major paper, but in a small industry blog that every municipal finance officer and public sector investor read. It was a surgical strike. The fallout was swift and quiet. Hadrian Civics Board, facing an SEC inquiry and a class action lawsuit from the municipalities they had defrauded, forced Julian to resign. The notary who had helped him was implicated. The consent decree that followed forced Hadrian to refund every penny they had taken from those communities. Julian's empire didn't collapse in a spectacular blaze. It dissolved, quietly and methodically, like ash in water. My own life, in contrast, was solidifying. I had moved on from my old apartment over the bowling alley, leaving the steady, comforting thrum behind. I had a new space, a small townhome in Northwest DC, a city I had once viewed with suspicion. It was a place of quiet purpose. I walked to work every morning, a new job with a small tech firm that specialized in public sector data security. The air was different here, filled with the buzz of purposeful ambition, not empty promises. The frost of my public shame had melted, leaving behind a clear, cool peace. I remember the day I got an email from Ms. Ortiz. The Quiet Ledger Foundation had helped her secure funding for a new filtration system on her tribal land. The email had a picture attached. It was of a small plaque on the side of a newly installed water fountain. It was a simple, elegant piece of brass, and the inscription read, "In honor of field engineers who kept the line." I smiled. I didn't need my name on it. The work was the reward. I drove out there the next spring in the kind of crisp, clear weather I had always loved. I placed my chipped nickel compass on the ground beside the fountain. My moral azimuth was now a part of the landscape. The final chapter wasn't about victory, it was about liberation. I had learned to discern the difference between a life of external validation and a life of internal peace. The woman who had stood in that vineyard, silenced and ashamed, was now the architect of her own quiet justice. I had found my way back from betrayal, not by fighting fire with fire, but by simply letting the evidence speak. I had built a new life, a new family, a new sense of purpose. My quiet justice was this: they didn't just lose their money and their company, they lost their reputation. And I gained something far more valuable, a quiet, unshakable faith in myself. I had not sought revenge, but I had found something better. I had found a way to heal, to build, and to rise. My past had been a low hum of warnings. My shame had been a public static. My discernment had been a quiet, relentless focus. And now I had found my peace. Have you found your way back from betrayal? If you've ever walked through something like this, tell me your story in the comments. I read them all, and someone out there needs to hear what you've survived. And if you want more stories that remind you you're not alone, stay here with me for the next one.